All right, everyone, we are going to get started with the stream. There's going to be a little bit of buffer here in the beginning as people load up and join, but I think we're good to go. So this stream is going to be about Cleopatra's Egypt. As we've done in the past, these live streams are meant to follow up on a previous documentary that we did, and then I bring on the historical researcher to add some commentary. So we're going to be looking to go a little bit deeper into the video, or perhaps explore areas that we didn't have time to go over, maybe even broaden the scope in general. So today the topic is going to be on Cleopatra's Egypt, and I am joined by Arian King here. I'll let her say a quick hello then.
Hello. I'm going to be just the, historical consultant, and I'm looking forward to talking with you guys and answering any questions you might have about Egypt around the reign of Cleopatra.
Very cool. Yeah, so the format for this series is going to go similar to what we did last time, where we're going to start with an introduction, and then we're going to break out into the various sections. So in this case, the sections are going to be on the history, the government, the economy, the culture, military, and then general Q&A. So in each of those sections, there's going to be a back and forth, a bit of a warm-up period between myself and Ariana. And then after that, we're going to open up to live questions. So definitely go ahead and post your feedback below. So with that being said, I guess we can start to get into things. And yeah, where do we want to start? Well, let's start with, I guess, some quick things that I wanted to clean up on the video before we get started. So the first thing that I did want to point out is I had a couple little oopsies in the video. Twofold. The first one is going to be, I believe I wanted to correct the Hellenes. In the script, I had pronounced it Hellenes, which people were questioning if that was even a real word, and it's not, so we'll retroactively correct that to Hellenes. And then the other one was about Cleopatra's lineage. I think I had a line in the script where we refer to her taking her life and her line ending, although, Ariane, I guess you can confirm that that's not necessarily true.
No, actually. Although her oldest son and her successor, Ptolemy the 15th Caesar, he was killed on the orders of Octavian, she actually had 3 younger children, including the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and their younger sibling Ptolemy Philadelphus, who were her children by the Roman general Mark Antony. We don't really know what happened to Ptolemy Philadelphus after this. He disappears from the historical record, and shortly after, the twins Alexander and Cleopatra were paraded in Octavian's triumph through Rome. Alexander also drops from the record, but her daughter, we know, went on to marry a Numidian king named Juba II, and they ruled Mauritania, and her grandson, actually, Ptolemy of Mauritania, was killed by the Roman Emperor Caligula, but he too had a daughter who lived to adulthood. So her line most certainly did not end, and depending on the sources we go to, there's been speculation that it can be traced as far as the Byzantine Empire, but that's a bit more speculative. But it most certainly did not end with Cleopatra.
Great. Okay, so we got those out of the way. Let's transition into the first section, where we're going to be starting off kind of paralleling the way we did in the video, which is looking at the history of Ptolemaic Egypt. So from kind of a macro level, before we kind of dive into all this, I did want to reaffirm kind of what we're talking about here. So the general premise of the video was misunderstood moments in history, Cleopatra's Egypt. And the misunderstood aspect of it wasn't necessarily the best defined from our sake. But essentially what we were getting at is when people think of Egypt, they only think of a finite, slaves and pharaohs in the desert being whipped and creating these pyramids. It's like static. We didn't really define it past that, and so we're going for more of a broad introduction to the period.
Yeah. Because, see, normally when we think of Egypt, especially in pop culture, it tends to be a very narrow view of Egypt, influenced by the New Kingdom and by biblical narratives set in Egypt. For the most part, Egyptian history is more than 3,000 years long. At the point in time where the Romans were writing on Egypt and interacting with it, it actually was already ancient. Kingdoms had risen and fallen in it. And it underwent numerous changes to its society, its culture, and its economy, So the idea of a stagnant Egypt, of a static Egypt, and of a sort of a land where time stood still was popular, even in academia, for a long time. But as new archaeological finds and finds of literary evidence and daily life in Egypt have emerged, we find that it's actually a much more complex picture, of a land that underwent numerous changes from within and without as it interacted with and was impacted by the rises and falls of civilizations in the Near East, Africa, and Southern Europe.
Very cool. So one of my opening questions was, how does the Ptolemaic period fit into Egypt's broader history? Of course, you have the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, some of these intermittent periods in between. So how do we kind of classify this Ptolemaic period, or how does it fit in with the broader history, in a sense?
Well, actually, a lot of Egyptologists would say that it does not at all. After the fall of the New Kingdom, Egypt was conquered by the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Although it did rebel for a short time under Nectanebo I and II, it was reconquered by the Persians, and only after this, after being a satrapy of the Persian Empire, was it conquered by Alexander the Great. I tend to consider Ptolemaic Egypt to be a part of the late period, with the late period being a period of Egypt after the New Kingdom had declined, and after it had begun to interact more closely with different Mediterranean kingdoms. So Ptolemaic Egypt is very much, in a sense, the twilight of the civilization that we might call ancient Egypt. Egypt was about to become something new. It was about to become more integrated into the fate and the civilizations and societies that inhabited the Near East, North Africa, and the rest of the Mediterranean. At the same time, though, Ptolemaic Egypt did experience a lot of revival of traditional Egyptian culture and civilization. We see the construction of traditional monuments and temples in Egyptian fashion, and we see quite a bit more, well, actually, the exportation of Egyptian culture to a great extent because of the Ptolemaic kingdom's connections to the rest of the Mediterranean. So it is and is not the decline of ancient Egypt, but it's the beginning of something new. Exactly where it fits into the broader scope of Egyptian history is somewhat debatable, and depending on who you asked, you would get a different answer.
Cool. Yeah, that's awesome. So that kind of puts us into context here, talking about Egypt. So has this idea about this period of Egypt changed over time? How has our understanding of this period changed?
It absolutely has changed over time. You know, earlier historians, especially in the 19th and early 20th century, tended to view Egypt as more or less unchanging. Even under the Ptolemies, they saw the Ptolemies as sort of, you had the sort of the grafting of a new dynasty onto ancient Egypt, a Greek dynasty and a Greek upper class and aristocracy that remained more or less isolated from the rest of the country, while the country remained stagnant, and the Greeks and Macedonians sort of cordoned themselves off, self-segregated themselves from the rest of Egypt. As we know now, this isn't true. There was actually a huge amount of interchange of ideas and integration among all strata of society between different cultures, you know, within Egypt. We know that the royal dynasty, the Ptolemies, actually did interact closely, in particular, with the Egyptian priesthoods to administer and to rule over the country, which was, in a sense, necessary. But we also know that on the lower levels of society, Greeks and Egyptians did interact quite closely, and these cultures did diffuse.
Cool. All right, so let's start transitioning into community questions. I did want to field some that were posed prior to this live stream. People are populating the chat with some. We'll get to those in a second. I did want to get some that were asked previously. So the first one that was asked was from C-Rock. What were the thoughts of the pyramids from locals and Greeks at the time? That kind of alludes to the fact that we're talking about Ptolemaic Egypt in the broader context. Let's look at it specifically about the pyramids, because that's always fascinating.
Yes. Well, actually, interestingly, one of the best sources we have for Egyptian history, well, actually, what the thought of Egyptian history, particularly Greeks at this time, are the sources of Herodotus and Manasseh. Well, Herodotus was a Greek historian. Manasseh was an Egyptian priest. He was commissioned by the Ptolemies to create a history of ancient Egypt. In it, he does describe how the pyramids were created by pharaohs who lived long ago. By this time, you know, the pyramids are about 1,500 years old, so 1,500 years have gone by. And naturally, their memory, you know, the collective memory of how they were built and why and when did break down a bit. It did change, but they definitely did understand that they had been built in the past as tombs and monuments by previous kings of Egypt. At the same time, there was a lot of wonder because nothing like the pyramids had been built really since. They were the largest man-made monuments, man-made structure ever created, and they dwarfed anything else in terms of just raw material and scope. So there was a certain sense of wonder, and some Greco-Roman historians actually expressed doubt that humans could even have built such things. At the same time, we also have graffiti and sort of notes from the Greco-Roman period in Greek and Latin, inscriptions and painted on that have phrases like Marcus was here, from tourists who came throughout the Greco-Roman world to visit Egypt and to see its wonders, and the pyramids most of all.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty awesome. So let's pull another question real quick. So people are asking, what did people think of Egypt, or what did the people of Egypt think about Cleopatra? So we'll talk more about her, the way she's presented throughout history later, but just real briefly, what did people think of Cleopatra? Was she thought of as one of the legitimate pharaohs at that point in time, or still very much considered an other or an outsider?
Well, yes and no. At the same time that the Egyptians recognized the Ptolemies as a legitimate pharaonic dynasty, they did still see them as having a foreign origin. For instance, her father, Ptolemy XII, is described as one of the Aegean kings, which denotes his foreign, heritage and its non-Egyptianness. And we can assume that in all likelihood these attitudes did not disappear between his reign and hers. But at the same time, the Ptolemies were very much respected. They were portrayed as pharaohs, they were considered pharaohs, and they had at this time ruled at the beginning of her reign for close to 250 years.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, so we'll be getting more and more in depth in the course of this video, but for now, let's go ahead and open the floor to more questions from the community. I still have a backlog of questions that were asked previously, but I'll sprinkle those in over time. I do see one here from the chat. Giekokiaya O says, how accurately could you say is Assassin's Creed Origins to Cleopatra's Egypt? I haven't played too much of the game. Do you have enough experience to answer that?
Yes, I do, actually, quite a bit. On the whole, in creating the world of ancient Egypt, the game did an amazing job. The way that the buildings look, the way of life of the people, their subsistence methods, their clothing, is all extremely accurate, and a lot of care went into portraying the flora and fauna of the game. The only two places I would actually say were a bit inaccurate are in the portrayal of the relationship between Greeks and Egyptians in Egypt and the portrayal of Cleopatra herself. With the Greeks and Egyptians in Egypt, it quite often seems to be based on a modern colonial experience. There we have a Greek class that is treated as being of higher value and higher worth by virtue of their ethnicity in the game. And there's actually, I noticed multiple references to skin tone, the difference in skin tone between Greeks and Egyptians being used as sort of a racial justification for the inferior treatment of Egyptians. Now, historically, this wasn't really the case. Not counting, intermarriage and integration among Greeks and Egyptians, it is true that Hellenes, Greco-Macedonians, did have to pay fewer taxes. And they did have access to different political and economic opportunities that Egyptians did not. This was, as we mentioned in the previous video, it was really a legal distinction because people of Egyptian ethnicity could have Persian or Hellenic status. They could be Hellenes in a legal sense, although in an ethnic sense they were very much not Greek. With Cleopatra, the portrayal of Cleopatra was based on modern pop culture, but it was highly inaccurate. Not only is her clothing, it does not match the royal garb that was generally assumed by the Ptolemies. It's somewhat fanciful, and other plot points like her use of opium is a bit humorous because opium pipes would not be invented until the 16th century. So she's a few centuries early with that.
Okay.
But on the whole, I'd say it's an accurate game. I'd say it was the most accurate portrayal of Ptolemaic Egypt to date, ever. And they did an amazing job bringing the country to life. The cities are real cities. The temples are usually based off of actual archaeological finds of temples. And it is just fantastic. I noticed some people questioned the appearance of various animals in game, like hippos and flamingos, lions and such. But it's actually interesting that those animals were present in Egypt at the time, because this was before Africa desertified. At this point, Africa still had a lot more forests and plains, and it was a lot greener, because there had not been the amount of climate change that occurred between antiquity and today, and also human activity in the form of agriculture, which cleared a lot of this greenery away. And hunting also did kill off several animal species which were present, like elephants, in Egypt at the time. So it was a different ecosystem 2,000 years today. And they did a nice job of portraying that.
Nice. I do see a question popping up as well from the chat. Warrior of Carthage asked, did Cleopatra ever take over other lands? So I'll switch over the map to show kind of Egypt at its height. I didn't play too much of the game, so I don't know if the game alludes to the various land holdings that Egypt had. So maybe you could talk about those two. One, the specific question about did Cleopatra conquer any other lands? And then two, is that alluded to or portrayed in the game?
I'm assuming you mean other lands besides Egypt, and the answer is yes, actually. Mm-hmm. At the time that she came to the throne, Egypt had lost, I believe, all of its extra-territorial, holdings. At its heights, the Ptolemaic kingdom had held some areas in the Aegean, in the Near East, and in other parts of North Africa. But Cyrene and the island of Cyprus had been lost in the reign of her father and grandfather, if memory serves. In her reign, actually, Egypt would expand once more. Cyprus was returned to her by Julius Caesar for her to hold and to rule over, and then she would later come to take Cyrene after Rome was plunged into the Liberators' War. Mm-hmm. Through her alliance with the Second Triumvirate, she also gained control of several regions in the Levant, namely in Syria, including the city of Antioch. She was given, not counting the donations of Alexandria, she was given regions, certain districts in Crete, not the entire island, but parts of it. And she also bought very large estates in areas like Judea, which she then loaned back to vassal kings like Herod the Great. But during the reign, yes, the Ptolemaic kingdom did expand quite a bit beyond Egypt. For those of you who don't know, Cyrene is roughly corresponding to areas in modern-day Libya.
Okay. And what was I going to ask as well? Well, I'll let you continue. Oh, actually, so the donation of Alexandria, could you talk a bit about that? I haven't. I'm not too familiar with it. I'm guessing the audience isn't as well, except for a certain few.
Yes. Well, the donations of Alexandria was. Well, to begin with, actually, I should give it a bit of context. So Cleopatra was for a very long time allied with the Roman Republic, in particular the Second Triumvirate, which was a power structure including the Octavian, the future Roman Emperor Augustus, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, although Lepidus was not long. So for the most part, we can just look at Octavian and Mark Antony as being the power players in that, as well as the Roman Senate. Through this alliance, she supported several Roman wars and also sent troop levies, supplies, ships, and the like, again, mostly supporting the Second Triumvirate in their war against the assassins of Julius Caesar and against the Parthians, who were an empire in the east. As a reward, she was given several territories that were reconquered. She was given control of former Ptolemaic territories, and also Mark Antony promised her territories that would be conquered once the Parthians were defeated. At the donations of Antioch, she was given Antioch, she was given certain regions in Crete, she was given territories in the Near East, and this was carried out at a complex ceremony at which she was dressed as the goddess Isis, and her children were also dressed in regal trappings. And a lot of these territories were not given to her directly. They were given to her children. For instance, Alexander received the as yet unconquered kingdom of Media. A few years later, we have the donations of Alexandria. which would be after Antony's war against the Parthians failed. This was in part because the king of Armenia, Artavasdes II, did betray him. So Cleopatra and Mark Antony invited him to Alexandria to make peace with him by marrying his daughter to their son. Instead, they captured him and his entire family, and he was then given the option to kneel before Cleopatra or to lose his head, and he took the latter option.
Yeah.
Afterwards, Armenia was given to their son, Alexander. This ruffled a lot of feathers in the Roman Republic because Artavasdes II had been a Roman vassal king, and they felt that Antony and Cleopatra had overstepped their bounds by annexing the kingdom and by killing him without asking for permission or so much as in "if you please." So this was actually one of the deciding factors in tipping popular sentiment away from Antony and towards Octavian, and it's one of the inciting causes of the war between Antony and Octavian, which ended in ruin for Mark Antony and Cleopatra.
Nice. Okay, we're going to keep rolling on. I do have 2 more questions here that I've pulled from the chat that we'll get to now, and then we'll roll on to the next section, which is going to be government. And then after that, at the very end, we have an open general Q&A. So everyone from the chat, keep that in mind. If you don't get your particular question answered here, there is an open section at the end, but I do want to keep rolling. So the 2 questions that I've pulled out is one from SWE, Sui, I guess. He says, what happened to Mark Antony and Cleopatra's children? So we did mention that in the very beginning of the video, but I guess not everyone was there for that. The brief recap is that Caesar's child, Caesarion, was presumably killed. The children of Cleopatra, I believe the male heirs were killed, but the daughters were brought to Rome and kept alive, and then later married into royalty.
Yes.
Yeah.
And actually, Cassius Dio, a Roman historian, claims that Alexander and Ptolemy Philadelphus, Cleopatra's son by Mark Antony, were actually spared. But there's problems with his account, so it's not sure how much we trust it. But it's possible that they too lived, and that out of Cleopatra's children, only Caesarion was killed, and the rest lived to adulteraage.
And they married into, was it Mauritanian royalty? I can't remember.
No, actually Numidian royalty.
Oh, Numidian, okay.
Cleopatra Selene's husband his father had rebelled against Julius Caesar and had perished. But Juba II was actually taken back to Rome as a hostage and a ward. And later on in life, he was given the kingdom of Mauritania, which was also in North Africa. And he married Cleopatra Selene, and they ruled there. Although Mauritania would be annexed during the reign of their son by the Roman Emperor Caligula.
Okay. Oh, okay, it looks like people are starting to ask questions more about different sections. So I'm going to ask the last one here, and we'll move forward. So Jay Dodo asks, how come Egypt hasn't expanded west? I guess looking at the map here where we're showing Ptolemaic Egypt at its height, which is pretty expansive. I mean, it covers, like you said, Cyrene, the Levant. It goes into the southern Greek cities of Anatolia, and it even goes into parts of Thrace. That's pretty extensive. So I guess the question about, was it going to go west? I think they already struggled to cover what they had currently, but do you know anything about expansion ideas to move westward?
They really weren't any ideas to move westward because one thing to remember about Egypt is its lifeline is the Nile. Outside of the Nile, which provided enough, water and which fertilized the soil, it becomes very much desert. And North Africa is enormous, and it was not uninhabited. There were various kingdoms and tribes inhabiting it, so it would have been difficult for them to expand west, and it also really would not have been worth it. They did expand a bit to the south, and slightly to the west when they conquered parts of northern Nubia, but that was for a very important...
Oh, I think we lost your audio. One second. We lost a call from Ariana, so she'll call back in. Not quite sure what happened there. So stay tuned for that. I hope you guys are enjoying the chat. I think she is very knowledgeable here. We're getting a lot of good stuff out of her. Let me go ahead and check in on her. Oh. Yeah, so she'll call back in just a second. Apologies for the pause. But yeah, like I said, in the comments below, definitely add in stuff appropriate to the section. I am logging some of the questions for further notice.
Hello?
Hey, welcome back.
All right. Not sure what happened there, but I'm back.
Okay, no worries. I was telling people to keep posting their questions.
Uh,
So
where
okay,
where did you drop out?
discussions about not pushing west and it not being worth it, but I think we get the gist of it. Unless you have any more comments about that particularly.
Not particularly, no, actually. There really was no reason for them to expand west, and it would have been more trouble than it was worth, is the simple answer.
Yeah, a lot of their successors facing off against them in the east, anyways, to deal with. Okay,
Yeah.
so let's move on to the next section. So the next section is going to be about government of Ptolemaic Egypt. So again, we're going to do kind of two parts of this. One is going to be me doing the warm-up with some questions that I had prepared beforehand, and then we'll be transitioning to some questions from the live chat as well. So some of the questions I have about the government of Ptolemaic Egypt is how was kind of the Macedonian Greek takeover and occupation different from the way the Persians did it?
Well, the Achaemenid Persian Empire was very hands-off. It tended to, where it could, leave the native administrative systems intact. The conquered kingdom became a part of the Persian Empire, but as long as it paid its tribute and it answered to the Persian kings, they were more or less left alone. They were able to do their own thing, essentially. The economy and culture of Egypt was not significantly impacted either. For instance, although the Persians used a system of currency involving minted coins, the Egyptians did not begin really minting coins in earnest. Whereas in the Ptolemaic takeover of Egypt was changed completely. Not only were large amounts of Greeks, hundreds of thousands, settled in Egypt, but Egypt began minting coins, it began paying taxes, and its bureaucracy was integrated into a more Hellenistic framework. So from the bottom up and from the top down, it was integrated into a new kingdom, and the Ptolemies were very active within their own kingdom, if only because it was the heart of their power base, of their empire.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas for the Persians, it was a very distant one at that.
Okay. And I'm going to switch over on the images here to show kind of our hierarchy that we'd prepared using a lot of Robbie McSweeney's awesome artwork. So this is just going to be running in the background to show you kind of the hierarchy in Ptolemaic Egypt. So the way we had talked about it in the video was, generally speaking, they kept much of the infrastructure of the bureaucracy of native Egypt, and then just layered over the top couple positions would be the new ruling class, so the Ptolemies serving as the pharaohs themselves, and then the top-level advisors that they would have had would have probably been Greek of Macedonian stock, or others who were kind of trying to get into that group by learning the language and the culture. But the rest of the administration, especially outside of the cities, would have been native, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So let me see what questions I had pulled previously about this. So I guess there was a question before about if we're talking about just swapping out the top and still running this large state. People were asking, how large was Egypt's existing bureaucracy that they took over?
It was extensive, actually. There's a lot we can't know about it because we simply do not have the same amount of records which have survived from earlier periods in Egyptian history as have from the Ptolemaic period.
Oh, I think we may have lost her once again. Sorry for that, folks. She will try and join again. I'm not quite sure what's going on. So, yeah, like I said, we're still, okay, she's calling back in. Sorry for this. Hey, welcome back. And don't have the audio just yet. Apologies for that, folks. So yeah, we're going to focus on government of Ptolemaic Egypt here. Let me tell her there's no audio yet. Hello? Still no audio. Okay, well, I'm going to be taking questions then from the community until she connects back in. So we were in the midst of talking about the bureaucracy of ancient Egypt, and I do know a bit about that. I think there was a pretty awesome Historia Civilis video where he talks about the bureaucracy that had to do with overseeing the agriculture, and it was insane the level of coverage that they had over that. had control over how much you could produce, what land you could stay on. They regimented where and where you could move. They distributed the equipment that you had, and then from the produce that you took, they then took a fair amount of it. So a lot of state organized and run elements of the economy. But we'll talk more about that when we get to the economy section. Let me see. She's trying to call back in again. Okay. Well, I'll keep taking questions from the community. So definitely post those in the chat, and I'll keep taking them. So someone says, how accepting were the natives to the Greek takeover? Okay, she's calling in. Hopefully we can answer that. No, still nothing. So it's my understanding from the takeover, essentially, that by this point in time, there would have been multiple generations that had the Persians come in and take over them, but then also the fact that there were Greeks arriving in the area previous to this, and so they would have already had that influence. But then when the takeover did arrive and you have this new ruling class, they did a lot to try and adopt, at least in terms of the visuals, a lot of the ways that the older pharaohs had ruled things. So if you actually go and look at a bunch of the like inscriptions and the depictions, the carvings of these pharaohs who were leading, they all look like, despite being of Greek and Macedonian descent, they very much look like traditional pharaohs. So there was a lot of an attempt to have some continuity there to ease things over, but I presume there was some tension as well. So let's see if there's any other ones that I can answer as well. Oakley, what is your favorite period of Egyptian history? I do have to say the Ptolemaic period, just because my main interest is going to be around the Roman era and anyone who's tangentially related to them. Besides that, I honestly don't know too much about ancient Egyptian history. Like I said, I was coming from a bit of the misunderstood aspect of Egypt, where very much to me, Egypt was a black box, where the only thing you get out of it is, from the movies, the single aspect where you see slaves and pharaohs in the deserts. And that's about it. Everything seemingly appearing very continuous. Someone else says, how much do the natives control at that area? So again, the Ptolemy, and that is Mohaddad Ahmad asked that, how much did the natives have control over the area? So I think that question is talking about, again, the government, which is the section we're in. So like we've stated before, and as the image shows here, the top level, so that's going to be the pharaoh, the ruling class, and then the kind of the government positions under them, the ruling council, and the people in charge of various government departments would have been probably Greek or Macedonian, or from their essentially friends and family in that sense. And Ariana is trying to call in. Still no audio. I'm hearing a little bit of something. Hello, are you there? So it looks like she's calling in, and I just hear background noise. So I'll leave her on here, and then we'll wait for her to call in. So yeah, let's keep answering some questions. How does the Egyptian tax administration compare to the Romans? So that's Bas van de Ven. So I can talk a little bit about that. I think the Egyptian tax collection was a lot more hands-on by government agencies, whereas the Roman tax collection was very interesting. Roman bureaucracy was a lot of, in a sense, hands-off, where they tried to co-opt whatever was there locally. And the Romans, in terms of tax collection, actually relied a lot on private groups. And so there were basically, if Rome annexed a new province... sorry, she's just pinging me with some questions. All right, I'm going to restart Skype in that case. Okay, so yeah, speaking still about the Romans in that case. So when they had a new province that they wanted to administer and they wanted to collect taxes from it, the Roman government wouldn't have done it by itself. What they would have done instead is essentially gotten private contractors, and essentially Rome's government said, hey, we expect this much money from this territory. You, private entity, go there and collect it for me, essentially in my name. And so the groups would try and bid into that process. And then when they won, they would not only collect what was due to Rome, but any additional taxes that they themselves levied would be profit for them. So that's some pretty crazy stuff. in terms of how punishing that could be once the private sector, in that case, got involved with the tax collection. Let's see. Noofster says, oh no, he's answering someone else. Mark Wang says, what's the population ratio between the Greeks and Egyptians? I think that was answered at some point in the video, where essentially, I believe the new population that came in was about 5 to 10% over the course of several hundred years towards the end of the Ptolemaic rule, when there had been a fair amount of immigration. At first, would have been relatively low, but then reaching about 5%, I want to say, tentatively. And that would have been kind of different based on the different cities. All right, let me check back in on Ariana. All right, I'll wait for her to call back. Let's see, other questions. Were there any standard battle tactics for armies in Ptolemaic Egypt? Ooh, that is something I necessarily can't really answer. We'll hold that for the military section, where hopefully she'll come back online. During the Ptolemaic time, one of the things that we did talk about is, hey, this is Ptolemaic Egypt. They are inheriting a lot of the stuff coming from the Greco-Macedonian and the Alexandrian way of war. So almost all of the successor kingdoms would have been modeling their military after Alexander the Great. So big phalangites with kind of hoplites and shield bearers on the flanks. You had some skirmishers as well. And then the heavy cavalry on the flank, trying to do Alexandrian-type tactics. But when you have these mirror matchups facing off against each other, they're going to try and find ways to outdo the mirror matchup. So what you see is you take Alexander's formula across all these kingdoms. Each kingdom maybe infuses a little bit of its local flavor. So, for instance, perhaps the eastern ones, which had access to greater cavalry, would have focused more on that, introduced more of the skirmishing cavalry. The Seleucids, who had access to the Indian elephant trade, would have used those more in the armies. Whereas the armies of Egypt, yes, maybe they had some elephants, but because they were a lot more intermingled with the sea, their military agenda would have had, yes, both land, but also a lot of sea, and they ended up dominating the sea. So that's for that. Olin Neal says, what was the reason Octavian overpowered Antony and Cleopatra in Antony's civil war? Oh God, it's hard to say about that exactly in these civil wars who won. A lot of the victories from Octavian is not necessarily due to Octavian himself, but his very competent generalship at the hands of Agrippa and a lot of his subordinates who were very, very good tacticians, etc., and especially the veteran legions that they had at their disposal.
All right, hello?
Hey, you're back. All right, cool. I've been holding down the fort. We've been going a bit freelance with the questions, but no problem. I think we've covered a fair amount. Let's see if there's any other questions that we wanted to answer before we move on to the next section. Or did you want to finish your point? I can't remember exactly which one we were looking at. Oh, size of bureaucracy, I think.
Yes, okay. Well, bureaucracy in the Egyptian period prior to the Ptolemies was certainly extensive. And it's believed, although we can't be sure, based on what evidence we have, it's believed that most of the bureaucratic systems of the Ptolemaic period were holdovers from earlier Egyptian kingdoms.
Okay. I do have some questions that came up that I wasn't necessarily able to answer. And I see another one coming up as well that's along the same lines. And it has to do with, if you're looking at the government, you have a new administration coming in. What was kind of the response to that? One, people were saying, how did the Egyptians react to this new ruling class? And then more specifically, Praetorian Guard Wear here says, were there any major riots regarding this Greek ruling class? So maybe we can speak to that.
Yes. Actually, more than riots, there was actually a revolt at one point. Upper Egypt, in southern Egypt, actually did attempt to secede from the Ptolemaic kingdom and establish a new dynasty of native Egyptian pharaohs. And they actually, this rebellion lasted about 18 years before it was quelled by the Ptolemies. We know there was some resistance to them throughout their reigns. There were rebellions, and there was banditry. And the secession of Upper Egypt during that time under the two pharaohs, Horwenifer and Og-Wenifer, who seceded from Ptolemaic Egypt. This lasted, like I said, it lasted 20 years, and it ended up encompassing more than Upper Egypt. It ended up encompassing Middle Egypt as well. So it controlled, at any given time, about 2/3 of the whole of Egypt, and it was supported by the Nubians to the south, who wanted to also do away with the Ptolemies, who had recently conquered parts of Nubia. But on the whole, it seems that the country itself did readily accept them to a greater or lesser extent as their pharaohs.
Okay.
And over time,
Oh, go ahead.
the situation became more stable.
Okay. Yeah, that's one of the things I was trying to say when I was trying to cover it for you, was saying, yes, there was some obvious resistance, but for the most part, the rulers did try and portray themselves or style themselves as previous leaders to try and kind of ease into things, adopt kind of local culture in a sense, or co-opt local culture to make it less abrasive, I guess. Then over time, things do smooth over. Okay, so with that being said, there is one last question here. I guess now that we're in government, we did talk a little bit in the documentary about the Ptolemies themselves, the ruling class, and the inbreeding. So a question that came up in both previous questions and I'm seeing here popping up in the chat is Antigonus Tigo Carchimodonius asks, how much of a negative impact do you think the inbreeding of Ptolemaic Dynasty had on Egypt?
Well, actually, if I were to say from a historical perspective, the inbreeding of the dynasty had none. For one thing, it's worth noting that the first Ptolemade who was actually born of a full sibling marriage was Ptolemy V, and many of the Ptolemies, although they tended to marry their siblings, quite a few of them were not actually the children of those two. They would be the king's child, paternally descended from the Ptolemaic dynasty, but of a minor wife or a mistress. So that did occur, but also because a lot of the issues faced by the Ptolemaic kingdom had more to do with environmental impacts than the nature of any one ruler. So one thing that's often pointed out is whether or not inbreeding had any effect on the mental stability of later Ptolemaic rulers. There's no evidence this was the case, but even if it had been, it really would not have made much of a difference, because for the most part their problems were caused by environmental factors such as famines, droughts, and also by problems going from outside of Egypt, their enemies, namely the Seleucids and Romans, and from civil dissent and civil wars within. One person pointed out, Noobster, username, pointed out that Cleopatra was highly intelligent despite being one of the last rulers of the line who had a lot of inbreeding in her ancestry, and that's also true. There's no guarantee that inbreeding will have a negative effect on individual rulers, although over time it does dramatically increase the chances of having negative recessive genes.
Okay. Cool. So I think that about wraps it up for this section about the history of or government of Ptolemaic Egypt. Again, we'll be able to answer some questions in the later general section, but I do want to move on. So I do have a little bit of a break here in the middle, which is going to be talking about the sponsor for the video. We'll make this quick, but essentially what happened in this video is I had already planned to do something on Cleopatra's Egypt because Assassin's Creed Origins was coming out and it piqued my interest. I reached out to the ACO team and they were pretty awesome. They sent me artwork, music, etc. and decided to promote the video as well and gave me a free game code. So that was awesome for them. So that is kind of the exchange that we had on hand. But one of the main things I do want to talk about the sponsor here is one, Ariana here already attested to the fact that if you want to relive history and even just marvel at the architecture and the sites, the game does justice to that. Another cool thing that they've announced here, I'm showing the kind of post-launch contest, is the Discovery Tour, which I believe is going to be coming out this month. And here I'm going to show an image of kind of what the Discovery Tour is. So it's a mode in the game where actually they strip away, I think, all the combat. And essentially, it's just you interacting with the game for history. And when you go to various hotspots, it'll tell you, text will pop up, and I believe there's a narrator as well. So this is such a cool feature. Has me very excited for that. And maybe in the future, what we can do is work with Assassin's Creed Origins. I don't know, to maybe do our own walkthrough with myself and Ariana. That'd be really cool. Have you heard about this mode?
Yes, actually I have, and I was very excited for that, because although Assassin's Creed takes very heavy liberties with history and with historical accuracy because of the nature of the game and of the story they're trying to tell, the journals that they had were always quite good. And in this case, this discovery mode has actually been worked on. They've done this working in conjunction with various archaeologists, various historians and other scholars who helped to consult on the game to create a game mode that is not about the story of Assassin's Creed, not about the video game aspect, but is entirely about allowing you to take a walk through history, to interact with, to see, and to learn on an intuitive and on a very personal level about the dynamic and complex period of time that they chose to portray. And I don't think anything like this has really been done before. And it has me very excited. One, because this happens to be my field of study, but also because it is just a fantastic thing to do. So I'm quite excited for this, and definitely I'm keeping my eyes peeled for it. In fact, a lot of the issues I had with historical accuracy in the game, I have no doubt will in all likelihood be addressed in this discovery mode.
Okay.
So
yeah, like I can imagine you may have a scene where you go ahead and interact with Cleopatra, and they can actually give you the real history as opposed to trying to like put her into this Templar plot point or whatever they've been trying to push. Yeah. Although I haven't necessarily played the game, so I don't know the full inaccuracies. But yeah, this is an opportunity for them to really not only match the visuals but also the narration and make those both more true to the history. So this has me excited, and I really hope that other gaming titles do something similar, or even that this becomes a staple in future Assassin's Creed titles. Okay, cool. So that's it for the plug. Let's go into the next section, which is going to be about the economy of Ptolemaic Egypt. So again, we're going to do the warming up section where I ask questions, and then after that we'll open up to the chat. So I had a little bit of a question, or a couple questions here about the economy. Let me pull up my previously asked questions. Okay, so the first one here, I'm showing an image of the Nile. So obviously the Nile is vastly important. Every time you talk about Egypt, it's in the same sentence as the Nile almost. So everyone knows it's super important. Is there some kind of way to truly understand how important it is? Like some sort of parallel to another civilization? Or is it just like, this is the defining feature?
The Nile, actually, I would say, is the standard that you might hold up to any other environmental feature that has shaped a society so fully.
Yeah.
As I understand it, 80% of the population of Egypt still lives within a very short distance of the Nile. That's the impact that it had on the development of Egypt. The reason why Egypt was able to build civilization so early, why it got such a head start, was because it was incredibly easy to farm there. There was no need to till. Multiple crops could be harvested within a good year, and the quality of it that could be grown in a very fertile soil with the ample water was of a higher quality. So nutrition was actually better. And because of this, people were able to settle, stay in one place much earlier. They were able to build cities, and then they were able to specialize. And the importance of the Nile went even beyond agriculture, because as we skip forward in time, in Egypt, you start having a lot of trade within Egypt, and without Egypt, the Nile acted as a highway. Because it's very hard to carry a large amount of goods overland. You have to have animals or people pulling them. Even if you have wheeled vehicles, it's difficult before you have motorized vehicles and things like that. But loading up a lot of supplies, a lot of animals, a lot of people onto a barge and moving them is easy and relatively inexpensive. And that allowed for a lot of rapid travel throughout Egypt and a lot of rapid trade. And in the Ptolemaic period, this continued as the Nile remained sort of the highway of ancient Egypt. So the Nile is the lifeblood of Egypt. Even after the Ptolemies introduced irrigation to extend agriculture and allow the area of arable land to widen, the Nile remains the heart of Egypt. And it still has today, actually.
Okay. And talking about Egypt and agriculture and that part of the economy, I had seen previous videos done, I think one by Historia Civilis, taking a look at just how crazy the agriculture was in terms of like government control. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that, but I do have a specific question someone posted. Oh no, this is about taxation. So maybe we can talk a little bit about the control of agriculture. We didn't get to that much in the video.
Yeah. Well, the amount of control that the Ptolemaic government had over agriculture is somewhat unique and unprecedented for the ancient world. It's worth noting that most Egyptians were tenant farmers. They did not own the land they worked on. They did not own the tools. They were provided grain and seed and tools, and they were told which plots of land to cultivate with what crops by officials who were sent out from, various hubs. They could be important villages or cities who informed them what they were to cultivate. And then their crops, they were given a percentage of as their wages. They paid a percentage of their crops as rent. and they paid a percentage of usually minted coins as rent as well. But from the very lowest levels, the Ptolemaic state controlled the agricultural output of Egypt. At the same time that we might look at things like the increased cultivation of Syrian wheat in durum as opposed to barley as a example of the Ptolemaic state exerting control over the native population. A good amount of this was actually the choice of the native population, because for the individual farmers, by cultivating these new crops, it allowed them to turn a larger profit and to prosper more fully than they might have had they remained cultivating other crops like barley and sorghum. At the same time that the state told them what crops they could produce, that they provided them with seed, some farmers did persist in farming whatever they wanted. Because generally, if these officials visited and they instructed them, they really could not control what they were doing day to day. Whether or not they farmed other plots of land nearby, exactly what crops they planted or when they harvested, at a certain point, there's only so much control you can reasonably exert over millions of people in a country that is, with fairly rural settlements. So I would say that definitely the Ptolemaic state had a ridiculous amount of control over the agricultural output of Egypt. And that gave them a huge amount of control indirectly over just the overall economy of Egypt. But it also would be good to not overstate how much this was.
Okay. There's another question kind of along these lines about the state getting involved. So Connor Smith says here, out of curiosity, I've heard that taxation was insane at this point in time, somewhere between 60 to 70% of everything a person produced being taken as a tax. Is this true or not?
Well, actually, this ties back into what I was talking about tenant farmers. It would probably be about more like 40 to 50% taken as rents. You probably could say that about half, on average, was generally taken in various taxes and rents and levies. But at the same time, it's important to know that much of these were that this counts tenant farmers who worked land that belonged to temples or to the crown. So they're working the land that as sort of paid laborers rather than farmers. So the rents and the levies and taxes they're paying are actually, in a sense, it wasn't their crops. It was the crops of the temples, the priesthoods, or the kings, or the aristocracy who owned the fields and who owned the crops and the tools and the irrigation systems that were used to plant them.
Okay.
So taxation was insane, but it was also just a different kind of underlying economic structure. So it wasn't really like a person going into work, making X amount of money, and having to pay 50% of it.
Yeah. Okay. The next couple questions we have about the economy are mostly dealing with trade. So let's go with the first one. So we're talking about the Nile being very fertile, having a lot of production. That surplus eventually ended up being shipped to Rome. So during the Ptolemaic period, how much of a breadbasket was Egyptian grain shipments to Rome itself?
Not as much as most people believe. They shipped, on average, in all likelihood, hundreds, if not thousands, of tons of grain. It very much depended on the agricultural output of Egypt in a given year. For instance, in some years, there were famines, there were droughts, and there just wasn't any surplus at all. But in other years, it was quite extensive. However, it's important to remember that first of all, not all of the surplus grain was sent to Rome. It was sold elsewhere in areas like Syria, in various foreign markets, and when it was shipped to Italy, it was generally sold. It wasn't given usually as a direct tribute to the Roman government in any sense. It's just that Italy was a very large purchaser of grain. It was the hub of a hungry empire. But even now, at this point, Egypt was not the primary breadbasket of the Roman Empire. At this point, Carthage and other areas of North Africa, Sicily, and Italy itself was. It would only be later on in the Roman Empire that they began to rely on Egyptian grain more heavily. But for obvious reasons at this time, they did not rely so much on the surplus of a foreign market.
Okay. We do have a question here that was just posed by Sky Ainsworth, meaning basically now that we're talking about the agriculture and surplus,
He's asking specifically, during Cleopatra's reign, was there a decline in both tech and agriculture?
No, not at all. I would not say that. In actuality, during the later Ptolemaic period, there was actually an increase. Irrigation became a lot more intensive. Of course, it's hard to say what you define as an increase of tech was. Certainly, the patronage of the arts and sciences and of literature discontinued in an upward spiral. Although, of course, there were periods of decline at various points in the Ptolemaic period. Cleopatra's reign was not one of them. We know that certainly medicine was it was very well cared for in Cleopatra's Egypt. We know that they were able to contain outbreaks of various plagues quite effectively. They were able to stockpile grain to survive years of intense and otherwise extremely damaging droughts and famines. But the system itself, the underlying systems of technological development and of agriculture, did not break down in any way, at least not that we know of.
Okay. Okay, there are some more here about the economy, and then we'll move on. So these have to do with trade outside of the Mediterranean. So the first one is from Tain Gurnick here. He says, was there trade between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, and was it taxed by Egypt?
Okay, so yes, there was absolutely a lot of trade. And no, it was not taxed by Egypt, but it was dominated by Egypt. Because Egypt, like I said, the Ptolemies had several ports along the Red Sea in Egypt and also in Nubia. And these controlled and took a lot of Red Sea trade from the Red Sea, namely to Arabia and also to India. Now, there was some Roman activity and a lot of Arabian activity in this area. But at this point, you had two major players. You had the Ptolemies and you had the Nabateans in Arabia. And they controlled most of the trade. But it wasn't really through taxation. It was just because they were the ones who had the ports, who had the coasts along the Red Sea to control this trade.
Okay. So speaking about trade, I think you mentioned trade with Egypt. So I see a question here from the Turk 321. Says, how reliant was Ptolemaic Egypt on Indian Ocean trade? How far did Egyptian coinage travel in the Indian Ocean littoral?
Well, I wouldn't say they were reliant on Indian trade, but it was extremely important. There was actually, after Alexander's conquests, there was a fascination with Indian culture, with Indian jewelry, with Indian clothing, and with artifacts like silk, of gems, and different things that could be imported from Asia through India. Actually, Ptolemaic Egypt had direct trade with the Indian subcontinent. Exactly how far Ptolemaic coins reached into Asia, it's hard to say. But there is evidence of Greek trade in Central Asia, as far as Mongolia. But this would have in all likelihood have been through an overland route and is probably not connected to the Indian trade. But we know that Ptolemaic trade did reach the Indian subcontinent and very far into that continent as well. So Ptolemaic Egypt was not reliant on it, but it was very important because goods passed through India, possibly Arabia, but possibly directly to the Egypt and Nubia into ports along the Red Sea like Berenike and Leucos-Limen in great numbers. And then from there, they were manufactured into finished products and shipped north to Alexandria, where they were then shipped throughout the rest of the Mediterranean.
Okay, probably the last question from this section then. So I Saw a Bear asks, what was the longest/furthest known trade route in Cleopatra's Egypt? So beyond India, I guess indirectly, but do we have any evidence of the Egyptians directly kind of having a trade route that went, say, I don't know, like the Phoenicians back in the day, I think had trade routes that went up to Gaul and things like that?
Well, okay, so there's actually multiple ways we can take this question. Not counting the Indian trade, we know that there was indirect trade and possibly to an extent direct trade further into Africa, through Nubia, into Central Africa and into the Horn of Africa, namely East Africa, areas like Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia. So that was pretty far inland, and it was an area that was otherwise not very well connected to the rest of the Mediterranean compared to, the areas in the Mediterranean basin. They didn't have much direct trade with Gaul or with areas like Northern Europe, Western Europe at this time, because there were a lot of other kingdoms between then and them. So any trade that we have is filtering through, Romans, through Greek kingdoms. It's passing through a lot of hands before goods produced directly in Egypt actually end up in someone's hands in a place like Gaul.
Okay, cool. All right, let's move on past the economy here onto the next section, which is going to be culture of Ptolemaic Egypt. So again, I'll be posing some questions from before, then we'll open it up. And just so everyone knows, the section after this will be military, so save your military questions for that. And then after military, we'll do a general Q&A to go back and kind of do a gish gallop of a bit of everything. Okay, so now that we're on culture, I'm showing the Lighthouse of Alexandria. So let's start with some questions that I have here. The first one I had was, how important was Alexandria as a cultural hub? Was it the kind of defining cultural center that dragged the rest of Egypt along with it in terms of the new cultural trends?
No, well, yes and no. Alexandria was the capital of Ptolemaic Egypt, but it was in many ways separated from the rest of the country. Geographically, it's not very close to the Nile compared to other cities. It's not very close to any other major cities. It was built on top of a fishing settlement, Rhocotis, that had been settled in dynastic Egypt, but had never been of much importance. And, in ancient times, people like to use phrases like Alexandria next to Egypt, or traveling from Alexandria to Egypt, to kind of convey the sense that Alexandria was its own city. And it was a city-state in many ways. It was a Greek polis. Being an Alexandrian citizen was different than being an Egyptian. It was sort of a state within a state. I would say that Alexandria was a cultural hub for the rest of the Mediterranean. It was where Egyptian culture met the rest of the Mediterranean, and it was where Mediterranean culture was more or less produced. It was at this point the most important city, possibly second to Rome, But at this point, in terms of intellectual and cultural attraction, in terms of architecture, it did still dwarf Rome, although Rome's power as the hub of a powerful empire was still strong. And over the next 50 to 100 years, Rome would come to dwarf Alexandria in the other regards as well. Alexandria was the city of the Hellenistic period.
Okay. Speaking of Alexandria, I know one of the topics we had discussed prior for maybe a follow-up episode would be discussing the Library of Alexandria fire. What was contained in there? People always spin tales of, all this long lost knowledge, almost as if it was an Atlantean treasure trove of some advanced civilization. Can you speak real quickly to what we think we know what was in the Library of Alexandria and what was potentially lost there?
This might surprise a lot of people here, although a lot of important, mathematical and scientific discoveries were made in Alexandria, like the studies of Euclid on different mathematics, of Hero in hydraulic doors. Most of the contents of the Library of Alexandria were literary. They were poems, they were plays, they were histories, and they were philosophies. So we don't really have a lot of lost inventions, lost technology that people like to think of. What was lost was, in my opinion, was still very much important. This was the intellectual and cultural heritage of not just Greece, but Egypt and the rest of the Mediterranean. We had works from as far as Judea, from even some of the writings of Confucius, according to some accounts, made their way into the Library of Alexandria. But it's also worth noting that not even all of these were lost in that particular fire that is usually pointed to, the one started by Julius Caesar's men, because it only specifically says that a warehouse was burnt and that part of the library was damaged. So we don't know how much this damage was, how much was lost, what was damaged, and exactly when these things were lost, because the library was actually set on fire multiple times from antiquity to the Middle Ages. It was partially destroyed and rebuilt several times. And even after its destruction, according to some accounts, Cleopatra received a few 100,000 volumes from the Library of Alexandria's sister library, its twin library in Pergamon, from Mark Antony, which would have replaced, in all likelihood, it was supposed to replace some of what was lost in the fires. But whatever was lost was in all likelihood predominantly literary as opposed to technological. And in all likelihood, the losses were not as extensive in that particular instance. It wasn't like the library all of a sudden was destroyed. It's just over time, these things were lost.
Okay, cool. I do have a section here where we'll be talking a bit more about Cleopatra, her depiction, her impact, and things like that. Before we move on to that, I do still want to stick on kind of culture broadly. And one of the questions about that is Alpha Sierra Hotel 117. I think that's an allusion to Halo. But anyways, he asks, was it true? Oh, sorry, I'm asking the wrong question. Notosol here asks, how much of the traditional native culture survived during the Ptolemaic Dynasty? Cultures that did not change much with the Greek influences.
Quite a bit, actually, especially in more rural areas. It was only in the Hellenistic cities like Alexandria and Ptolemies that we really see a very small amount of Egyptian culture. But for the average person living in Egypt, their way of life did not change much. Of course, religious beliefs and medicine was slightly impacted by Greek culture, and in the cities even more so. But at the same time, Egypt had always been connected to the rest of the Mediterranean. Actually, a lot of our best sources on Egyptian histories, on Egyptian religious texts and dream manuals and medicine are actually Greek copies or Greek translations and Demotic copies of Egyptian texts. Because Egyptian priests, Egyptian scholars were very active in this time, and Greek scholars took a very keen interest in Egyptian culture because they tended to look upon it quite highly. But for the average Egyptian, the way of life, how they dressed, what they believed in, did not change much. Of course, if they were living in a city with a Greek gymnasium, if they were married to a Greek, or if they served in the Ptolemaic army, then the difference in their life and in their beliefs might be quite profound. They might worship a deity like Zeus, or they might associate a hero like Heracles or Hercules with Horus. They might have a Greek name in addition or in place of an Egyptian one. So it really depends on where the person lived, what their background was like, what their life was like. But Egyptian culture remained very strong, ancient Egyptian culture. And though that culture survived into the Roman period and after the Islamic conquest of Egypt, and actually in rural Egypt, quite often studies are done on the Coptic individuals and the rural Egyptians because a lot of their oral traditions, a lot of their way of life in terms of how they eat, how they live, we can see the echoes of this ancient heritage in their modern descendants. So it even to an extent does survive today, albeit, of course, not in any stagnant or unchanged fashion. But there's like the outline of it, the ghost of ancient Egypt, if you will.
Okay, cool. So talking about kind of the intrusion of different cultures or the infusion of different cultural influences, there are three more questions about that I do want to address before we get to speaking about Cleopatra. So these questions are about, okay, we've already discussed Hellenic culture coming in, but these three questions are about other cultural influences, which are a bit more minor. But real briefly, the three ones that people are asking about is one, cultural influence from the Levant. The second one is cultural influence from perhaps Indian contact. And then the third one is going to be from, I believe, the Galatians. So let's maybe start off with the Levant. Levin Atanasayan here asks, were there cultural influences from the Levant? So we'll deal with that one first, I guess.
Absolutely. Even before the Ptolemaic period, Egypt had long had strong cultural ties to the Levant. Actually, there were three main influences we can see in ancient Egypt's development. Part of this was from within Egypt, from peoples around the Nile. As we move out of prehistory and into early history, very early history, the people who were living in modern-day Egypt along the Nile, their culture, but they were also impacted by migrations, people who came with their own cultures, their own methods of making pottery, their own methods of burial and belief. who came from the Levant and migrated to Egypt, and also who migrated upwards from down in the Blue Nile, areas like Sudan, and further into East Africa, who migrated northwards into Egypt. So the Levant was a very early impact on Egypt, and it continued to be make an impact, and to be important to the development of Egyptian culture long after, as the Egyptian Empire often held territory in the Levant, and the Ptolemaic kingdom did as well hold territory in the Levant. Mercenaries from areas like Syria and Judea were used by the Ptolemies quite extensively, and they brought their customs and their culture with them. So did Phoenicians, who were actually well represented among traders. Jews in particular were well represented among the scholarly class of cities like Alexandria, where they formed a significant minority population.
All right. The other two about Indians and Galatians, maybe we can touch on that real quick. I do want to move forward. I know you have limited time, though.
Yeah. Indians were actually, I actually don't understand the amount of contact that India had with Egypt as well, because there's a lot of ongoing research that's still happening. And although we have references to Indians in various inscriptions, as elephant drivers, as traders, and as priests, we don't actually always know if this is referring to Indians or to people who held positions that they were referred to as Indians. Because, as I noted, ethnic labels often did refer to ethnicity. So it's hard to say if, for instance, in the case of an inscription referring to an elephant driver, if they were referred to because they were Indians or because they drove Indian elephants. But there was definitely cultural contact between the two. Indian religious thought did impact Egyptian, and especially Hellenistic Egyptian religious thought to an extent. There was art and jewelry and clothing, as I mentioned, spices and different luxury items like that, perfumes that were imported from India to Egypt, and that the Greeks, the Hellenes, did make a huge impact in India as well, through the establishment of, albeit short-lived, Greek kingdoms in northern India.
Okay, and what about the Galatians? Although we can table that if you want to and talk about it in the military side.
Well, we can talk about it here, although it really is mostly military, because the Galatians were, for the most part, mercenaries. We know that they were hired by kings like Ptolemy II to serve as auxiliaries. We know that on several occasions they rebelled. For instance, the ones hired by Ptolemy II rebelled, and they were supposedly marooned on an island in the Nile that was about to be covered over by a high tide, and they all drowned. But we know that they continued to hire Galatians and Gauls as mercenaries, namely as cavalry, in later periods. We also have references from the 2nd century BC onwards of Galatians in papyri. I think the first known reference to a Galatian is from the 2nd century BC, and it refers to a Galatian slave who was bought by a Greek in Egypt. So we know that they were in Egypt, they were there as freemen, they were there as slaves, and they were there as mercenaries, but they were most certainly predominantly would be well represented among the mercenaries of Ptolemaic Egypt, rather than so much as migrants.
Okay. All right, let's move on to the next section of kind of culture, which is looking more specifically at Cleopatra. So I'm going to be pulling up a couple images of Cleopatra, her various depictions over time. So I'm going to have an image from a coin of her, a piece of art, Hollywood's depiction, and then Assassin's Creed depiction over time. My first question is, all of these kind of have their own individual takes on Cleopatra.
Yes.
What is like our source of truth on this?
First of all, to begin with, let's start with the more ancient evidence. Of course, we have the coin portraits and art portraying her. The problem with coin portraits in particular is that the Ptolemies like to reuse coin portraits, the minters, that is. So quite often a coin that might be bearing the features of a previous ruler would just be slightly altered to bear the name and to look a bit more like the new ruler, and the same coins would enter circulation. Second of all, probably the most striking thing, that the thing that is always pointed out on Cleopatra's coin portraits and on her busts is her markedly hooked nose. This is actually it's a hallmark of the Ptolemaic Dynasty, because rulers like Ptolemy II, Ptolemy V, they were noted for this eagle nose. It makes a huge appearance in how they're portrayed, and it was at a certain point a trademark of the royal dynasty. So it's hard to say how much this was actually an inherited trait, or how much she may have deliberately chosen to look more like her Ptolemaic ancestors in order to secure her own legitimacy. And this extends to her father's reign as well, because her father was illegitimate. So with them, we can see, with both her and her father, we see a lot of posturing and a lot of trying to conform to this Ptolemaic legitimate ideal, more than even we might have seen in another ruler, because it was somewhat necessary. With later portrayals of Cleopatra, especially when it comes to film and to video games, it is very much fanciful, because it's drawing on a sort of a really modern Western tradition of portraying her with the famous Cleopatra bangs. She was never depicted or described as, looked as wearing her hair in that fashion, although she does occasionally in, I believe, Assassin's Creed Origins, and usually does in film as well. Generally speaking, her hair is always depicted as being drawn back into a bun. She doesn't look very much like her, modern incarnations either, in terms of her features. And in terms of clothing, she's in ancient accounts and in art, she's usually depicted quite conservatively. She's wearing the normal garb of the Ptolemaic rulers, which would just be a himation or a chiton, which is a term for Greek robes. The kind of robes that were often worn by female deities like Hera, or the Hellenized version of Isis. And her crowns are usually not complex either, elaborate in any way. They're the simple Macedonian diadem, which was a strip of linen tied around the forehead, or a metal band of silver, gold, or iron worn on the forehead.
Okay. A question that I do see recurring, at least in previous questions, was selection for various skin tones. We've seen different ones, probably having to do with different kind of at the time contemporary depictions of beauty. So in the past, people who were very perhaps more pale or light skin tone, that was the preference. And so you see maybe older depictions of Cleopatra being a bit more bleached looking, and then more modern trying to be a bit more darker in tone. I think in the images that I'm showing, at least, we do see a range of all of them. Do we have any indication about that? I know you've posted about along those lines before.
The thing is, we don't actually know. Cleopatra, we know, was of predominantly Greco-Macedonian descent. And these were people, the Macedonians are believed to be at least closely related. There's a bit of a controversy there, but I'm going to go ahead and say they were closely related to the Greeks in Southern Europe. She also does have some ancestry from West Asia, areas like Anatolia, and further into Central Asia from areas like Sogdia. She had an ancestor who was a Sogdian warlord, which is in modern-day Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan. Now, in all of these areas, and including Greece, there's kind of a range of skin tone. Individuals generally aren't extremely pale, and they're generally not extremely dark. So if we had to guess, we'd say that she was probably fair-skinned but swarthy. But we really don't know, because ancient accounts don't take the time to really describe her appearance at all, actually, which is something that I think a lot of people don't realize. At no point do they really say what she looked like. The closest thing to a description of her skin tone we can find is from a Roman poem written about a century after her death, which describes her as fair. But that does not tell us much, because that can mean whatever you want it to. So honestly, the thing with all of these depictions, all of them could technically be correct. We just don't know. She could have been paler, she could have been tanner, but there's really not much of a difference one way or another.
Okay. All right, what are the questions? Okay, shifting a little bit, it looks like I do have a question that was posed earlier. I'll transition over to that image.
So the question was, what's the deal with religion at this time? Was there fusion of Egyptian and Greek religion? So we did address that there was some fusion previously, but it was only in, I believe, a sentence or so. So can we talk maybe a bit more about the religious practices? And I'll let, as you maybe give us an intro, I'll let people in the chat catch up and ask more specific questions.
Absolutely. So it's sort of all of the above. There was a bit of a fusion, but at the same time, you did have Greek practices and Egyptian religious practices that remained more or less separate. So what we have here is most notably, we have what's called syncresis. So that's where certain deities, like certain Egyptian deities and certain Greek deities, might be seen as being one of the same. The way that we see Jupiter and Zeus as being essentially the same, or Mars and Ares, they saw deities like Osiris and Dionysius as Hera, or Aphrodite and Isis as being the same. And that actually, that was an important theme, but at the same time, these different deities were not seen as necessarily, they were seen as being the same deity, but not necessarily having the same traits, because they were different facets of a god. So, for instance, Aphrodite might be the more maternal, the more loving, the aspect of Isis that deals with feminine beauty and marriage, whereas Hathor might be seen as the aspect of Isis that deals with agriculture, fertility, protection, Hera, the aspect of Isis that deals with royalty or with magic or power. So we have that. We did see the construction of shrines and temples to Egyptian deities. We know that most Greeks adopted mummification, so they no longer cremated or inhumated their dead. They began to have them mummified by Egyptian priests. And we know that Egyptian and Greek ideas about the afterlife and the soul, what it was and where it went, did mix to a great extent.
Wow, that's really interesting. Did that mummification spread back to the Greek homeland, or is it just in Egypt that happened?
Oh, no, it was actually only in Egypt. Actually, we know that Romans or Roman Egyptians of the Roman period also adopted mummification, but mummification does not seem to have spread outside of Egypt and Nubia. It seems to have been isolated then there, which is interesting. And it indicates that the adoption of mummification by the Greeks in Egypt was as much because of cultural pressure and assimilation within Egypt as it was the spread of Egyptian ideas, because Egyptian deities spread to Greece and they spread to the Mediterranean and in the Roman period even to Britain. But mummification does not seem to have.
Okay. I'm going to pull up some more questions. Praetorian Guard says, did the Egyptians mummify their dead or bury them according to Greek ways brought from Ptolemy? So I think
they continued to mummify, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so they started to transition more to the Egyptian way. Antigonus Tigo Cacrodonius here says, how in the world can one compare Osiris to Dionysius? I would get Hades, but Dionysius?
Yes. Well, that's because Osiris, he was the guardian of the afterlife, but he was the guardian of rebirth and fertility. He was killed by his brother Seth in Egyptian mythology, but was resurrected by his wife, Isis. Now, in Greek mythology, Dionysius in certain myths is also killed, and he also rises again. And as the god of wine and grapes, he's also associated with fertility and with joy and with growth and with green things. So from there, the Greeks just sort of extrapolated, and the Egyptians as well. They took certain attributes from both and combined them together into a deity that's like Osiris and is like Dionysius. But at the same time, sometimes the conflation of deities can be a bit confusing, like the identification of Horus as Hercules. It doesn't necessarily make sense, but because of certain obscure attributes or attributes we don't think of today that were important at the time, the comparison was made, and once it was made, it stuck, and the gods themselves, the perceptions of them and their worship changed to fit this association.
Oh, I see more questions as well along these lines. So talking about the gods and the rulers, Sui here says, so I heard that Alexandria got declared a god by the Egyptians. Is that true?
Yes and no. He was considered to be, he was proclaimed as the son of Ammon. And Ammon was a very important god in Egyptian mythology. He was combined with Ra to become Ammon-Ra, who was the ultimate deity in the Egyptian pantheon. And he was conflated with the Greek Zeus. So Alexander was considered the son of Ammon Zeus, a demigod, a divine ruler, and the rightful king of Egypt.
Alrighty, that's about it. I think for this one, I'll let people catch up in the general Q&A, but let's go ahead and transition over to the next section. We're pushing on a little over an hour and a half, or almost an hour and a half now, so let's move over to military here soon. Okay, so military of Ptolemaic Egypt. We did go through this in the video, talking first about the army and then the navy. In terms of the army, we said that many of the successor kingdoms did inherit the traditions and the compositions of Alexander the Great. And even though these kingdoms had a lot of, native troops, they preferred to recruit from veterans and immigrants from the Greek and Macedonian world to fill their armies. But then, of course, over time, you can't sustain that. And so all of these successor kingdoms, or most of them, had to deal with manpower issues and then inevitably started to recruit more and more locally and integrate those with their forces. So that's kind of the general overarching story. The image that I've put up here shows on the left some of the early troops, and on the right, the increasing adoption of Egyptian natives, both in light troops, which they were serving kind of early on, and then increasingly in the heavy infantry, the officer class, etc. So one of my main questions, and the ones that keeps recurring, is how strong overall was the Egyptian military, I guess, in this point in time? And it's hard to say, admittedly. I mean, it's 300 years. But I'll let you decipher that one.
Well, to begin with, it was a superpower, because Ptolemy I was one of the 3 or 4 most powerful generals of Alexander. I mean, there were lots of generals at this time. We have Seleucus Nicator, we have Lysimachus, Antigonus, but Ptolemy, the reason he took Egypt was because it was a good kingdom, it was a wealthy kingdom, it was easily defensible. And from there, he was able to make war with the other generals of Alexander after Alexander's death, as they fought over his empire. So for generations, especially in the reigns of Ptolemy II and Ptolemy III, it was incredibly powerful. It was able to harass its enemies on the Mediterranean to a huge extent through its navy. It has a sizable army and was apparently well led because it made several victories. But then later on in the reigns of Ptolemy IV and V, there were revolts in Egypt. There were civil discords and different issues going on, and they became unable to keep this up in the long run. They were unable to defend their territories in the Near East and the Aegean, and they were having a hard time holding on to Egypt itself. As I said, part of Egypt actually seceded for nearly 20 years. And then as we go on, it just became more and more difficult. They lost basically all of their Near Eastern territories to the Seleucid Empire, which had been founded by Seleucus Nicator. And one of the Seleucid kings actually invaded Egypt and was able to defeat the Ptolemies throughout most of it. But before he was able to sack Alexandria, the Romans sent an envoy, and they essentially told him that if he actually decided to conquer Egypt, then he would automatically be on their naughty list. He'd be their enemy. So it was only for that reason that he decided to withdraw from Egypt, and the Ptolemies were able to hold on to it at all. And after that, their power was greatly diminished. They never really recovered. So although, they had a sizable military, they began to rely more heavily on foreign armies, on foreign support, and on Roman support in particular. In the reign of Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, he was usurped by his wife and daughter. And it was only through the intervention of a Roman army that he was able to gain his kingdom back. He had to bribe Roman politicians and Roman generals until one of them, Aulus Gabinius, actually marched an army into Egypt and put him back on the throne. And that legion that he marched ended up becoming disavowed, and they just became mercenaries to the Ptolemies. But because of their power and their position in Egypt, they also played a role in Egyptian politics. And this set the tone for how Rome's military would play a large role in the inner politics of Egypt during the reign of his son, Ptolemy XIII, and also Cleopatra.
Some specific questions that people are posting here. Tane Gurnick here says, were they a professional army or conscripted as the need arose? So it's my understanding that they did have kind of the palace guards, and some of the garrison forces may have been full-time, especially the palace guards, but the rest of them were kind of pulled up in levies as the need arose, especially the phalangites. Same thing as would have happened in other kingdoms in the Greek and Macedonian world.
To an extent.
Okay.
They actually worked on a system of cleruchic military. So they had they had a sort of a class, if you will, of warriors, of soldiers, of cavalry, of infantry, and of ranged fighters who, not counting mercenaries, were actually they weren't conscripted. They were trained from the beginning. It was a hereditary class. And although they were not active in the military year-round, they were always reserved. So when the Ptolemies went to war, they had to be called up. They supplied their own weapons, they trained themselves, and they formed the backbone of the Ptolemaic military. Now, this extended to the Greek soldiers who had settled in Egypt, who were maintained as clerics. They were paid a stipend when they fought, and they were given plots of land in exchange for a life of military service. And with the Egyptians, when they conscripted them, they were not known as clerics or cleroi, they were known as machmoi. But they got a similar deal. They got a smaller plot of land. They were also paid, and they were to be called up whenever the need arose. So rather than, what you might imagine with conscription, going into a village, gathering all the young men, and all the peasants, and putting spears in their hand, actually these were well-trained and well-equipped soldiers who, their job, their purpose was to fight in Egypt's wars.
And I see recurring questions now that we've discussed that about maybe to discuss more of the mercenaries or specialist troops. Two of them are popping up. First is an allusion to the Nubian archers, and then the second to the Galatian mercenaries. So I'll continue to put off the Galatian mercenaries for a second. The person who's posting here about the Nubian archers is saying that, to their knowledge, they're highly priced and often used by the pharaohs of earlier dynasties, so very prized. Were they a recurring feature in the armies?
Well, Nubians in the Egyptian army, yes, they do seem to have been a recurring feature, partly from Nubians who settled in Egypt and also from hired mercenaries. The fact that he mentions archers in particular is interesting because actually Nubians were famous for their skill with the bow. It was possibly their iconic weapon. We know that Nubian archers were used also in the Persian army as auxiliaries. And Nubians, in all likelihood, were present in the Ptolemaids' auxiliary corps, but they were not cleruchic soldiers or machmoi.
Okay. So what about the Galatians? Now, finally, I guess we can talk about how they were introduced and kind of what their role was in the army.
Yeah. Well, while Alexander was conquering parts of Asia and the Near East, and after his death especially, the Gauls began migrating out of Western Europe, out of areas like that we might associate with them, like France and Austria. They started migrating south. We know that some of them, under Brennus, ended up in Italy. Brennus actually sacked Rome, and many of them attempted to invade Greece, but they were more or less destroyed. A lot of them ended up settling, these Celtic people, they ended up settling in an area of the Mediterranean known as Galatia. They became very Hellenized, and others settled in areas like Anatolia in modern-day Turkey, and they were hired because they were seen as very good mercenaries, although they were often looked down upon from a cultural standpoint and to an extent from an ethnic standpoint. Although ethnic tensions weren't really the same in the ancient world, they didn't function the same as they do now, but there was some stigma attached to them, but they were highly prized and highly sought out as mercenaries. And they did actually form several reasonably successful colonies in the Mediterranean, although they did not tend to last outside of the Hellenistic period. After that, they mostly disappear. But they formed an important role in the Ptolemaic military.
All right, slight aside here. I am seeing one comment asking about background noise. I'll check on my end, and maybe if you could check on your end, but to the chat, we'll try and keep that to a minimum.
Yes.
Not sure what it is. Let's see the next one. Well, let's toggle over from, I guess, the infantry to the cavalry. So again, amazing job done to Robbie McSweeney here. I think you had given him some feedback on the artwork, but for the most time, he did a pretty good job depicting it, I think, on his own, or doing his own research.
Yeah, absolutely. Robbie McSweeney did a fantastic job. The only notes I had were mostly on the equipment of the archers, because as you might notice, they're not wearing any armor. But from what we have our artistic evidence and our literary evidence, it seems that archers and slingers were sent into battle without armor, because they weren't really seen to need it. They would have been a good distance away, and it would only weigh them down. And especially in the climate of Egypt, it was very hot, and they were actually faster and more effective without it weighing them down. Even linen armor was somewhat debilitating.
Sweet. And same thing goes for, I think, the further back you go in the ranks of the phalangites. Only the first couple ranks would have had all the full
armor.
accoutrement. Yeah. All right, so now I have an image pulled up of the cavalry and the elephants. So this is where I wanted to make a couple points. So the first thing is about the elephants. Compare and contrast that to the Seleucids. People have asked us to comment on the difference between the two militaries. So the Seleucids, I believe, would have had access to more of the Eastern influences, so access to more of the varied cavalry forces, both in terms of light cavalry, but also the heavy cataphracts, and in terms of different access to elephants, the Indian elephants, that would have been a larger variety. Can you think of other elements of the Seleucid army that set it apart?
Well, the Seleucid army, it seems to, at least from what I know, it did not have the exact same manpower issue that the Ptolemaic kingdom had. When it comes to elephants, the Ptolemies were able to obtain elephants, but the Seleucids, when they took most of their northeastern territories, they cut off their supply to elephants from Syria and India to a great extent, and the Ptolemies had to rely on African elephants, which were not the African elephants we know of. Today they were a different species that lived in North Africa. They were forest elephants. They were a lot smaller and less aggressive than the Asian elephants. So in the one major engagement, the Battle of Raphia, where the Ptolemaics African elephants were pitted against the Seleucids Indian and Syrian elephants, the African elephants were just, they were no match. They, for the most part, actually fled when faced by the larger and more aggressive elephants. So it was a bit of a disaster, and after that, they simply stopped using them.
Had they used them prior to the Alexander's conquests?
Do you mean the African elephants? No, because for these elephants were only opened up to the Hellenistic armies once Egypt had been conquered by Alexander. Prior to that, it doesn't seem that the Egyptians had ever used them to a great extent. We know that they were caught, they were trapped, and they were hunted by the peoples living in Africa at the time, in Eastern Africa and in Egypt, but they were not used as animals in warfare. They weren't used as beasts of burden to any extent or anything like that. So it was only during the reign of Ptolemy II and III, according to Ptolemaic histories, that they began using them as war elephants. Actually, there's an inscription found in Upper Egypt which is praising Ptolemy III and Ptolemy II for importing the elephants and for domesticating them for use in war.
Okay. Yeah, I find that kind of interesting that the Carthaginians, their other African neighbors, did adopt them, but the Egyptians who had access to them didn't necessarily.
Did not. No.
Okay. Cool. So that's it for, I guess, actually, there is a last question before we move on to the Navy. What was the role of chariots? Because I know early on they were a big role of the Egyptian armies, but that was perhaps before people had a good grasp of cavalry. And I think once there was a more general mastery of cavalry, the chariots decreased in influence. But I think they did make a resurgence, right, during this period as the successor kingdoms tried to experiment again with ways to outmatch each other.
Actually, no. For the most part, war chariots do not seem to have been used by the Ptolemaic kingdom to any great extent. Yes. Actually, after the Bronze Age collapse, it seems that Egypt really did not rely on them as heavily. At one point, they were the core of the military, but after that, most of the civilizations around the Mediterranean, the Near East and Africa specifically, stopped using them. According to Greek and Roman accounts, though, some peoples in Africa and North Africa continue to use chariots, but not Egypt, really, and definitely not Ptolemaic Egypt.
Okay. Not the Seleucids. I'm just coming from experience from, I know the Total War games, they always give them to the Eastern kingdoms. So maybe sporadic use here and there, but nothing instrumental in the army composition.
No.
Okay. Sweet. Let's move on to the Navy then. I will pull up an image as well. So in terms of the Navy, I guess Egyptians early on, like we said before, had a lot of connection to the Levant. The Phoenicians as well, which were kind of the originators of the maritime model of ships, I guess, in the Mediterranean. Then the Greeks kind of adopted it, improved it, expanded it, and then eventually it comes back to Egypt as well, and they end up supersizing it. So I guess how much did the Navy change for Egypt before and after the introduction of the Ptolemies? Do we know that?
Well, for the most part, Egypt was really not a naval power. They had a lot of maritime trade along the Nile, but they did not engage in naval warfare to any large extent with their neighbors. Really, it was only after the Ptolemaic conquest that we see Egypt begin working on a sizable navy and on becoming a naval power. But this is because the Ptolemies really, rather than so much experimenting with new forms of warfare, like all the successor states, they were about bringing Alexander's method of warfare, the Hellenistic method of warfare, and just making it better, which usually meant making it bigger, building bigger ships to fight the same naval battles using Greek ships, Greek designs, about finding ways to make the Macedonian phalanx work better, about using the phalanx with their heavy cavalry in Macedonian fashion in better ways and better strategies for that. So they got kind of tunnel vision to an extent with their military technology, because there was sort of an idea that if it had worked before, it worked the entire time. Why change it? The formula was perfect.
Yeah.
And
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, that's all.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't known too much about Egypt not having that much of an established navy, because you would have thought, as it's set, a lot of potential for trade, and just as the Carthaginians were, when you are in control of trade, you find yourself having to have a big navy. So that's kind of interesting.
It is.
Yeah.
But the thing is, Egypt, for the most part, although it's expanded into the Near East and into areas of Syria, for the most part, it was never and at no point in its history was it necessarily an expansionist state. At least it did not center its world around the Mediterranean. Like for the Romans and the Greeks, the center of the world was the Mediterranean. But for the Egyptians, it was really the Nile. So they did look to the west, they looked to the Near East, they looked south to Nubia, and they did expand to an extent, and the Egyptian empire grew quite large, but they never really thought or felt the need to build a large navy or to have any power in the Mediterranean, because it wasn't their objective, it wasn't their goal.
Got it. There is a question here. I guess we're going to be diving into the Navy a bit more than I anticipated. Let me pull it up. It was a comparison. Okay, here. Mars asks, what is the comparison between the Egyptian Navy and the Roman Navy? Were they greater or weaker? So I'll let you comment, and I have a little bit of experience about the Roman Navy, but I'll let you go first, and maybe we can tag team this one.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to say really which was more powerful than the other. The Ptolemaic Navy was certainly large. It was certainly impressive. And the Romans and the Ptolemaic Egyptians used really similar technology when it came to building their ships, when it came to their methods of warfare. So we see triremes that use both oar power but also have sails. They are fitted with large rams for ramming, and the sailors and troops aboard them are used to pelting missiles like arrows, stones, and such onto other ships and into boarding other ships and fighting on deck. So it's a very similar method of warfare. And at the point in time that, if we look at, say, Cleopatra's war with Egypt, Ptolemaic Egypt had a very, very large navy, right? Especially in terms of shipbuilding capacity. right? Because Cleopatra's reign, we have a lot of references to her building ships. We know she built a huge amount of ships for the war with Octavian. And the Battle of Actium was the second largest naval engagement in antiquity, the second largest naval engagement certainly that involved the Romans, with the first largest having been with the war against Carthage, which, as you noted, as a former Phoenician colony, was a very a state that placed a lot of emphasis on naval power. But of course, the Romans won that war. But at the same time, we don't actually ever have a straight-up battle between the Ptolemaic Egyptian navy or the Romans, because, it was not just Cleopatra against Octavian. It was also Mark Antony and the ships and sailors and marines that he brought with him. And even if we had, it wouldn't necessarily tell us who was more powerful. Just, a certain amount of that is luck of the draw. A certain amount of that is strategy and who's in charge and the background leading up to it. A lot of the reason why you could say that Ptolemaic Egypt lost the Battle of Actium is because of losses that had occurred previously. And after that, after Ptolemaic Egypt was conquered, the Romans actually decided to pedal back on the emphasis on naval warfare, because there really were no more enemies that they fought on the sea. After that, they started referring to the Mediterranean as Mare Nostrum, Latin, RC, because they controlled virtually all of the Mediterranean.
Yep, and the history of I'll talk a bit about maybe a bit the matchup of the navies. So there's like a general history of warfare in the Mediterranean when it comes to these ships. So first off, it starts with these vessels of trireme size and maybe a little larger, where the focus is very much on seamanship. Who can have the sleekest, fastest ship? Who can navigate it the best? Emphasis on ramming. And that's kind of what the Carthaginians and the Greeks and others had gotten very good at, and they kind of faced off in that sense. When the Romans entered the playing field, they were a little bit different. They had almost no experience, and they had a hard time fighting that type of warfare, being inexperienced as they were. But what they did have was a lot of resources to pour into it, and so when they came into the naval warfare, they came at it with a lot of numbers and a different take on it. So they knew they were good when it came to close quarters. So their take was put a lot of ships at sea, try and grapple in close quarters, and switch the game from what would have been kind of a dance of ramming and maneuvering to just a close as quickly as possible, tackle the enemy, and board them over. So that's kind of the early stage when the Romans were fighting against the Carthaginians. Later on, when the Romans then kind of meet the Hellenistic kingdoms in the east, the Hellenistic kingdoms where they had fought previously with the ramming and all that, but the ships, as we said before, were getting larger and larger, beefier and beefier. And with these larger ships, you have larger contingents, potentially of marines, archers, and artillery. It means that the Roman approach of just trying to board you would have been a lot more difficult. And that's actually something we see attested to at the Battle of Actium, where you have the forces of Augustus, led by, I believe, Agrippa, at this point in time. They had smaller vessels. I think the largest was perhaps a hexareme, or smaller, whereas the eastern vessels much larger, and they, because of the size differential, actually had a hard time boarding the ships. So you have these interesting matchups at this point in time. Although I believe... go ahead.
It's worth noting that the largest Ptolemaic vessels actually didn't see combat.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah, for the most part, like you mentioned, the largest ships that the Ptolemies tended to throw into combat were roughly equivalent to the largest heavy Roman vessels, because past a certain size, they just became unwieldy and just impossible to maneuver or to really move around in combat.
Yeah, especially so I think the largest one that we have noted at Actium, I think, is a 10 as a flagship.
Yes.
But the Tessera Contaries, which is even larger than that, supposed to have a crew of like almost 5,000 people. That ships of that size never really got out past the shore. They were just vessels to almost brag about and to play a psychological game.
Yes, and even the 10, Cleopatra's flagship, never actually saw combat in the Battle of Actium, and it was the largest vessel in the fleet. It wasn't really that size so much for any strategic advantage, or because it was believed that it would really give it an edge. A lot of it was just the impact that a ship of that size would have. And because the Ptolemies, the Ptolemaic Dynasty had like a fixation on large ships, on giant vessels, on totally outdoing the other Hellenistic kingdoms, and the monarch ship, the flagship, was always the jewel of that.
Okay. Cool. All right. With that being said, I think we've done a whole bunch of stuff. Let's transition over to the general Q&A where we can open the floor. I know some people did join a little bit late to the game, so this will allow us to maybe go back and capture some questions they had previously, and then it'll also put us in a position to start wrapping up. So let's transition into the general Q&A here. So I'll open the floor to questions from the community now. I'll let people start populating the chat, and I also have some that I pulled earlier. So the first one is going to be directed at yourself. Which of the Ptolemaic pharaohs is your favorite?
Oh, wow, that's difficult. Well, possibly Ptolemy II. He built the Library of Alexandria. It was in his reign that the Lighthouse of Alexandria was created. He expanded the Ptolemaic kingdom and really established the dynasty. Although his father, Ptolemy Soter, he took Egypt, and he established what would become the Ptolemaic kingdom after Alexander's death. It was Ptolemy II who put it all together. It was him who really created the Ptolemaic dynasty that we know, and he set the tone for how it was going to go. He set the tone for the Ptolemies, their relations to Egypt, to their Greek subjects, for what Alexandria was going to be, a hub of culture and knowledge. In addition to him, I'd probably say Cleopatra VII, the famous one, because she took an Egypt that had declined to its lowest extent in history, that was in debt, that had lost all of its extraterritorial provinces, and was starting to be torn apart by civil war. And she, over the course of her 22-year reign, she built it back up into something that could be considered a superpower, into something that was powerful, something that was strong. She introduced numerous economic reforms. She reformed Egypt's foreign policy. And in her personal life, she was also quite an interesting character. She spoke like 9 or 10 languages. Based on what Roman accounts we have, she authored texts which are attributed to her on medicine, on weights and measures, on philosophy, and various subjects like that. So definitely an interesting character.
Okay, I think people were asking previously if we could confirm that she was the first to speak. Is it Coptic Egyptian or Coptic?
No, Coptic had not yet actually developed at the time. Coptic Egyptian is descended from Demotic Egyptian, which would be the dialect spoken in Cleopatra's lifetime. But it is true that she was said to be the first Ptolemy who could speak Egyptian.
All right. Let's see some other ones. I do have some more that were pulled from earlier. Sui had asked, did Carthage and Egypt ever have a battle or war?
No, actually. Carthage and Egypt were allies. For one thing, Carthage and Egypt were at opposite sides of the African continent. Because although, of course, Africa, it's long, it's also wide. So Carthage all the way to the west and Egypt in the east, they did not interact closely, and they never had any territorial disputes. But we know that they had a close diplomatic relationship. And during the Punic Wars, Egypt actually at first declined to pick a side, because either way it went, it would alienate one of its allies, Carthage or Rome. Although it eventually sent, supplies and aid to Rome once the Carthaginians sided with Egypt's enemies in the Seleucid Empire and Macedon. But they never actually engaged in a war, and Egypt only reluctantly began to support Rome instead of Carthage.
Sweet. Some more questions here. So people are asking, Effective Altruist here says, what book would you recommend about Ptolemaic Egypt in general when you have little prior knowledge? So I will post in the description of this video, and actually you can refer to our original video about all the references we used for the documentary if you're interested. But if you had to pick one, maybe for someone who's just getting into it, do you have any recommendations?
If I had to pick a book for someone who was just getting into it, new to the history of the Ptolemaic Kingdom, I would pick Egypt in the Age of Cleopatra by Michel Chauveau. It was originally a French language volume, but it's recently been translated into English. It is, I would pick it because it's very approachable. It's very basic. Most of the literature on Ptolemaic Egypt at this point is highly specialized, right? It's focusing on a single aspect of the economy or society or, culture or the military. But Egypt in the Age of Cleopatra, that book focuses on basically everything you could want to know. You'll learn a little something about daily living. You'll learn a little something about the religion, the culture, the history, because it starts at the beginning of the foundation of the Ptolemaic Dynasty and continues until just after Cleopatra's death. So it's interesting. It's an easy read, and it's actually very enjoyable.
Thanks for that. Strider here is reminding me that there was a previous question that came up that I told them to defer till now. So I think the question here is asking, were there other big knowledge hubs in antiquity besides Alexandria?
That's an interesting one. Prior to Alexandria, it had been Athens in Greece, because Athens it continued actually to have an important impact on the cultural and intellectual heritage of the Mediterranean long after, especially in the Roman period, although it actually had declined by the time Alexandria enters the picture. The library in Alexandria, the Seleucids actually tried to mirror with the library in Pergamum, which also had a very extensive collection, although it was nowhere near apparently as impressive as the library of Alexandria. But I would say Athens was another one. Pergamum also, had some intellectual importance. And after Alexandria started to, enter its twilight a little bit, Rome began to supersede it, especially in the days of the Roman Empire, when Rome was the capital of the Mediterranean to an extent. Rome did dwarf it in many ways.
Alrighty, another question here. Again, asking your opinion. So Sky Ainsworth asks, what do you think of other TV shows' depictions of the period, like HBO Rome, Star's Spartacus, or the movie Agora?
Okay. Well, to begin with HBO's Rome, I don't want to say too much because it is definitely one of the least accurate depictions of Ptolemaic Egypt. Yes. I actually am familiar with the show. It is an enjoyable show, to be sure. And from what I know from many of my colleagues who study or teach Roman history, it does get a lot of things right, although it gets a lot of things wrong. It's the best for Roman history in terms of pop culture. But for Ptolemaic Egypt, I think they went for more of a timeless feel of Egypt. And their portrayal of the Egyptian court in Cleopatra is almost entirely fabricated. So at a certain point, it would be easier to point out the accuracies than the inaccuracies, because they're sort of accidentally woven into an inaccurate framework. For Agora, I think they did a nice job with creating Alexandria. They did dramatize and fictionalize the life of Hypatia of Alexandria to a great extent, but it was actually an interesting movie, and I did enjoy it. Star's Spartacus, as I understand it, it focuses entirely on Rome and gladiators, so I won't speak about that as much. But basically, everyone I know who studies Roman history or who works in the field or something considers it to be highly inaccurate. And from what I've seen, it is. But it is also, it is entertainment.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had similar things. People say like the movie Gladiator is a great gateway into Roman history and antiquity, but after you get into it, you realize all the inaccuracies and whatnot. Let's see what else. People posting comments here and there, kind of follow-up questions. People are asking if we could do a series on the Seleucids in the future. So potentially, maybe we can use this kind of to start wrapping up. What do you foresee in terms of like follow-up episodes or interesting topics that you think we could do about maybe the Ptolemaic area or whatever your area of expertise ends up being?
Well, with the Ptolemaic period and the Hellenistic period in general, there are so many directions you could go in. You have the cultural evolution of Ptolemaic Egypt. You have Egypt's interactions with the rest of the Mediterranean, the way that Egyptian culture and objects and commodities and religion spread throughout the Mediterranean and even into northwestern Europe and into Eastern Africa, and as far as areas like Parthia. But at the same time, you can look outside of Ptolemaic Egypt. You have the Seleucid Empire to the east. You have the Meroitic Nubian Kingdom, which interacted quite closely with Egypt and Ptolemaic Egypt in particular, and which fought a brief war with the Roman Empire after the death of Cleopatra, because the Nubians attempted to annex Upper Egypt after that. They were defeated, and they sort of met a stalemate, and a treaty was signed between Augustus and the Nubian queen Amenarines, where they more or less left the existing border between Ptolemaic Egypt and Nubia as it was. So no territory changed hands, and captives who were taken and statues that were looted were exchanged and given back. So that would be an interesting one. You could also talk about the history of foreign peoples in Egypt, how they emigrated to Egypt, the establishment and history of Alexandria, which, for a single city has such a complicated and colorful history, It's almost a country in its own right. You could look at the interactions between Rome and between Ptolemaic Egypt, which they had, hundreds of years of interactions, which were at times actually quite interesting. So there's a lot you could take it in.
And I was going to say, speaking of cities, Saint Sin here is asking us to real briefly mention, I believe, the sunken city of Heraklion east of Alexandria. That could be something to touch on.
Yes, it could actually. Heraklion was, it was an older Egyptian city, but it was renamed Heraklion at the Ptolemaic period, actually along with Alexandria itself and several other cities along the Egyptian coast. As the water levels rose and the shape of the coastline changed, the cities became submerged by water. But they're actually wonderful, because that means that a lot of the archaeological finds that were there, a lot of everything can be found in situ, which is a term in archaeology, as it was, rather than having been looted over the hundreds and thousands of years. So that is interesting.
Very cool. All right. Well, I've held you a little bit longer than I said I would, so I think we'll start wrapping it up. Did you have any finishing thoughts before I do my little outro here and wrap up? I have some comments I have to add as well.
Actually, I think that is about it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this. I enjoyed answering these questions. They were very good. You did mention that we can post a bibliography at the end with certain reading. And also, I just wanted to take a brief moment to give a plug to Ask Historians, which is a community that can be found on Reddit, where I and several other academics, historians, and well-educated amateurs answer various questions, any questions that the community might have all the time about history. I can be found there under the username handle Cleopatra_Philopater, and asking several other very qualified individuals. So if you wanted to take a moment of your time to pop over there and see what might take your interest, definitely do that. But other than that, I very much enjoyed my time here discussing the history of Ptolemaic Egypt here.
Yeah, no, I think this is an awesome opportunity. People were asking kind of early on in the chat where I find the historians, and it's honestly through the Ask Historians community. So it's been great. They've been very welcoming of my kind of overtures to talk with you guys, and having yourself and other members come on here and discuss directly with the public and put up videos is awesome. I don't think I can't speak for you particularly, but I would imagine you don't get a chance to do this too often in the academic field.
No, certainly not. Not to interact with, a community, an open community of, lay people and enthusiasts, and certainly not as closely. That is one of the nice and unique things about YouTube and about Ask Historians, because quite often there is a distance, a gap between the academic discourse of history and the public's perceptions of history. But the opportunity to interact with people directly and to talk and engage with them about history is actually exceptional, and it's enjoyable, and it is important actually to foster interest in history and knowledge of it.
Yeah, this is a really great endeavor, and I'm eager to see where things are going to go in the future with this. Definitely the world of academia, and especially the way it's taught, is changing very rapidly, so this is very cool. So to end up on that note, like we said, we'll post the books that you can read in the description below. You should also check out Ask Historians, and then you'll be seeing more history content on the main channel here, especially with Ariana in the future. We're looking to do follow-up episodes. And then lastly, before we do end this, I do want to state that I am anticipating separating the channel into two, keeping the main channel as history focused and increasingly moving my gaming content over onto the second channel, Invicta Gaming, just so I can separate the two, because it's a little bit odd, and it must have been a bit odd for you when I told you, hey, I do history stuff, and you look at my channel and it has a bunch of gaming content. So anyways, I'm going to be streamlining both of those, so the viewers will then have kind of clean subscription feeds in that sense. So that's it for this video. Thanks everyone for watching. Definitely leave your comments below in terms of what you'd like to see in the future, and share this content around. That'd be great. It always helps to get more publicity. Share the news, and it incentivizes us to do more stuff. Do you have any plugs for yourself, publications, or things we can try and promote?
Well, I have a few articles out, but you can find those via my profile page on Ask Historians, where I list various projects I've worked on, various articles. It's actually under construction at the moment, but a few of the links can be seen there. And I am looking to branch out more into YouTube, into social media. But as I do that, I will be sure to post those links and to, let the community know about those.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to it, so I will end the chat here. Thank you everyone for watching, and we will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.